Hello, and welcome to Paul and I's second newscast. This is where we look at current events through the lens of the boardroom. My name is Michael Iannini. I'm the founder of PDAcademia, and joining me is Paul, who is the founder of Future Directors Institute. Paul?
Hi, nice to see everybody again.
Yeah, and today, we're going to be talking about diversity in the boardroom because there's been a lot of headlines lately about diversity. A lot of it, if you're from the US, and I think the Australian audiences as well, we see a lot about gender diversity, but there's also a lot of talk about cultural diversity. And another lens that I want to add is the generational diversity. And why this is important for you in your boardroom is because if our communities are looking at these headlines and they themselves may not be board members, but they're reading these headlines and looking at the problems it's causing for those organizations, they could be questioning, hey, what does our school board look like? Is this a potential threat to our school board? In which case, if they're getting ahead of this before you, that's a potential problem and could lead to even certain levels of activism that could undermine you. Paul, I was just in Beijing last week, and I was meeting with an old business partner of mine. She and her friend have done a phenomenal job over the last few years since I left Beijing to grow a business that we started. They now have 18 kindergartens in Beijing and Nantong, and every year she tells me, Mike, will you come back to Beijing? Will you help us with this? And every year I have to say no. My family's happy in Hong Kong. But part of my no is also when I reflect on their own form of governance is the fact that, yeah, you got 18 kindergartens. This is a massive industry. And yeah, you're going to be printing money when you get it right. But think of me as that head of school that somebody wants to hire, or that superintendent, or that director. I'm looking at this organization and I'm looking at their board, and I'm seeing these are two friends of mine, and we work well together because we could be very critical of each other, but that was a smaller business that has now grown much larger. I look at their board, and effectively it's a management board. It's not a governing board because their board consists of the shareholders. I myself am not a board member in this case because I have a very minority stake in it, but when I look at the other board members, they are effectively the head of the school, the curriculum director, and the marketing director. And I was saying to my friend, is like, look, you need to get your governance right, and you need to effectively hire a director for the schools. And on top of that, you need to start differentiating your brand further, and
Yep.
these are all the things that I'm telling her as an outside stakeholder that effectively is a governance role. I'm not going to be doing that for you, but these are the things you need to do. Whereas she's looking at me saying, hey, just come in and do it, even if it's just for a couple months. I'm like, no, that's not the way it's done. And so, I'm looking at her room through the lens of the, of how this can be a successful entity. And it's like, you need to get a governing board, and that board needs to be diverse enough that it's helping you to get these different perspectives about what you need. Additionally, when you have that diverse board, it also opens up a network for you of so many other contacts, people that know people that know people. So, I want to start off our segment just with that personal anecdote saying, I'm actually turned away from potentially millions of dollars just from the fact that I could come into that organization, but with effective governance, I may not get that reward at the end. So why risk my family and our lifestyle that we currently have to go down that road? And there will be a lot of other people that will also be questioning in the same way, not just my friend, but our viewers, and potentially their board if they're looking to attract people. So diversity actually is a great way to attract people, and we talked about this recruitment before. But enough about that sort of somewhat related tangent. But let's look at what's going on in the news, Paul. What are you reading? What are you seeing?
Well, there are a couple of things I'm seeing, and it really relates to cultural diversity and also, but diversity in general. So coming out of different areas has been this. There's a lot of talk and a lot of action, and not as much action as we should have around diversity in general. And it seems to be focused heavily on gender diversity, and I like to think of it as equality rather than diversity in that respect. This is sort of natural level of diversity that comes from having a gender diverse board. And the problem is that's moving quite slowly, and we're starting to see it drag. And especially looking at some research out of PricewaterhouseCoopers, their global director survey, saying that 80 to 90% of directors believe there's benefits to diverse boards. The problem is they also think that we are overly obsessed and focused on diversity, and that one of the reasons for it is political correctness. And so, and then within that, there's a divide between female directors and male directors in their view. And obviously you can probably guess that female directors are far more positive towards the reasons for diversity. But by and large, people are thinking that diversity is a good thing. Maybe not so much from a performance point of view. So again, if you think about, corporate boards, performance, shareholder performance, but also for non-corporate boards where performance is measured in other metrics, whatever their metrics are, it's not a performance issue. For them, it's more, they bring unique perspectives. My thinking here though is like these two are completely aligned, bringing unique perspectives, having robust debates, as long as there's an inclusive culture. And that's another thing which we'll get into a little bit. These lend itself to more informed decisions, which should lend themselves to better performance, whatever that happens to be. But I'm really interested, given your experience, the fact you live in Hong Kong, you work in Hong Kong, China, around the cultural diversity. And I've been reading some stuff recently about, how cultural diversity can actually be a negative in a board. Yeah. Because you have different values, different ways of seeing a problem, basic language issues. And I don't mean like translational language issues potentially, but just in the use of language. And that when you have diversity of, age diversity, gender diversity, skills diversity, which is really important, technical skills diversity, especially in this age. Cultural diversity can actually have a negative impact on the organization. I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, 2 points. First, I want to come back to the communication aspect, because you're right. We want to leverage all these perspectives, but if we don't have strong facilitation in the boardroom, if we're not effectively communicating, it's all wasted. And this is a soft sell. November 27th, we're going to be doing a webinar on effective communication in the boardroom. So be ready for that one, everybody.
Always a salesman.
But it also, as you started talking about all these certain levels of diversity, it got me thinking about, you and I both do board audits. And we just basically listed for everybody right there an auditing tool that talks about, hey, are you looking at your board through gender, age, culture, race, skills? Right there are 5 areas of diversity that we could be looking at, and then going into deeper as far as part of our auditing process. So that's something I look forward to actually after this call, probably working out further with you. When I think about cultural diversity here in the Asian context, yeah, you would think that with a lot of the international independent schools that you'd see a lot more cultural diversity. But interestingly enough, you do not get a lot of Asian board members. There are the self-perpetuating boards that are much more, for the schools that are much more prestigious, you will find more Asian governors there because they are very highly esteemed in the community, and so they're invited in. And self-perpetuating boards, they're there for a long time, and this is a position of honor that many people see, and particularly in Hong Kong. And I've seen this in other areas in Southeast Asia as well, in Singapore. Whereas then you have our boards that are more parent elected, or you have even for-profit boards. And there, though, you see no diversity. And in fact, the diversity is starkly seen from a gender perspective. It's not seen from the gender, the culture, race, and even skills is sometimes a dearth. And sometimes these boards are only focusing on skills. So, even though in the news we're looking at, a lot of talk around, hey, how come we don't have more women in the boardroom? And when I sit down and do board facilitation, I get, a majority of the Western members saying, hey, how come we can't attract more Chinese into our boardroom? And, they're asking these questions and solely focused on it. And I'm of two minds. It's like, yeah, perspective is important. And we do want people that can speak to those contexts. But I recall one Chinese governor that was in a school that was predominantly the families were Chinese, but the board predominantly was Western. And this one Chinese governor basically had mentioned, look, our concern isn't so much about sitting here in these seats. There's, we tend to be much more practical. we want to see, we want to use our time more effectively. We want to spend more time with our family. We're very appreciative of you. And she was speaking as if she was a parent, not a governor, that you do spend this time and that you're very interested in it. And from our perspective, we just kind of expect that's the role you want to play. And, we want to support you. When things go wrong, yeah, we're critical. And a few of us can maybe express that inappropriately, but for the most part, we also appreciate the fact that if we don't take on that role, it may not be our position. So don't look at this from being that we don't want to participate. We're just assuming that this is something that is more important to you. You want to see good management of the school. So for the board side of it, we're actually not so focused on that. We're actually more interested in the head or the principals or the teachers. And that's something that maybe from our perspective, we feel we have less power over, not understanding that the board influences that. So that was
so is that
really interesting conversation.
I was going to say, is that because there's a lack of, a couple of questions there. Would you say that's typical culturally? That what that one Chinese parent said in your experience, and also would you think that it's because of a lack of knowledge about the role of the board and its role in sort of like hiring the head of school and setting strategic direction and that sort of side of things, that means that they don't think that's a place where they can actually have the influence they want to have? And also, is there some historical cultural stuff there?
Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot of angles there to throw at you there.
But definitely, let's reflect on a couple things. Number one, I'm gonna bring up Hofstede's cultural model. We talk about one particular cultural attribute called power distance. In the West, we normally have a much lower power distance, where we see ourselves much more equal with leadership. In the East, you have a much higher power distance, where, hey, they're the boss, they'll tell me what to do. So from an Asian perspective, and also when we think about the impact that Confucian teachings have had in terms of the family structure and people's understanding of the roles that they play in society, many in the Asian culture would see it first as being not their place to want to play that role. And for many reasons, because there's also several Chinese idioms that talk about cutting off the head of the snake that pops up. I mean, they themselves, they don't want to put themselves in that position. They're another cultural attribute is, communal versus individualism. So when you take into account power distance and communalism, Asians are much less likely to want to gravitate towards those board roles. And they're more likely to want to approach from the school perspective of wanting to trust and invest that authority directly into those that have been selected for it. So therefore, they'll take more of a backseat to it. But also, they also tend to be much less conflict adverse, surprisingly, for, with all the conflict that can happen in schools across Asia, Asians typically will be the ones less likely to incite it. That's not to say they won't. We're all subject to getting over impassioned about the welfare of our children. But for the most part, they themselves are more likely to step back from it and not want to directly engage. So when you think about what's needed at the board level, trying to trying to infuse that sort of cultural element would be incredibly important, but yet also from that cultural perspective, from their side would be, I want to say inappropriate or not appropriate, but maybe not their role. So it could be difficult to attract those members, but yet we need to have that lens. So the real question kind of comes back then, Paul, in the absence of that lens, how do we ensure that we include that in our debates?
It's a really tricky question, because as you say, there's a lot of cultural sensitivities there. And if you are trying to attract people, are you getting people of, and again, for want of a better phrase, westernize their value system to, and that's made the sort of the boardroom an attractive place to be, in the same way that, and again, I'm trying to tread carefully here, some female directors, like some female politicians, can actually have upplayed either naturally or inorganically their masculine power traits or traits to actually get into positions of leadership. And whereas we don't want people, we want people to be their natural selves. So I wonder if whilst there's this demand coming for cultural diversity, gender diversity, generational diversity in the boardroom, is there this, like you just said, is the supply actually sort of going to be there? Is the pipeline going to be there? Because some of them don't want to be there. And if they do, are they really the right type of diversity that we need? Like, again, I struggle with these questions. We talked about beforehand about, supply and demand, and how, the role of a board director or governor is getting harder and harder. You've got more stakeholders, more people, there's more transparency, the laws are getting harder, there's a lot more being asked of you. You're not just a governor in a closed room anymore, you're an ambassador. You're a you're a communicator to the community. You're a celebrity almost to some degree. There's a lot of celebrity directorships still going around, and you've probably got more paperwork to read because there's different angles. You've got to start worrying about policy after policy. We talked about in our last newscast about the LGBTI and religious freedom type stuff as well. Like, this sort of stuff probably hasn't been around before, and now we're piling this workload on, and this gets out. So, probably people can take on fewer roles, whether that affects school governors or not. But if you take about general board roles, but also it can get out, this role is too hard. And so why would you want to become one? So you've got all this demand because, boards need refreshing. They need a constant state refresh, but there's not supply. And I remember the workshop we ran in Hong Kong recently, and one of the things we were talking about recruiting more board directors, and they said, we never get enough applicants. Yeah. Even if we really, really put it out there, we just don't get enough people wanting to be on it. So I do worry that, there's going to be a lack of supply, and we're not doing enough in our society to attract people to the world of governance, whether it's schools or whatever, but also let them understand that it's actually a very positive experience. And it's a great thing to do with yes, it's hard work, but it's a great thing to do. And I really worry about the future. And again, that's the sort of work that we're doing, Future Directors Institute, is about sort of generating that pipeline, next generation pipeline, and bringing in different people. So yeah, it's the whole diversity thing. The last thing I want to say about diversity is that diversity is fantastic. And again, I'm not sure many people disagree now that diversity, which brings that cognitive diversity, whatever happens to be, whether it is generational, gender, culture, race, skill set, it flounders without an inclusive culture. And I think you mentioned that at the top. If you don't have a culture within the organization, with a boardroom whereby everybody's voice is appreciated and needed, then you're going to lead to conflict, and then everybody's going to turn away from diversity and say, God, this was a failed experiment.
Well, hey, I got a quick question to you about future directors, because this is interesting from a school perspective, and it just got me thinking. firstly, we're talking about succession planning. I could see when your clients are talking to you about future directors, and specifically, hey, how do we get, maybe they're asking, I don't know, you can tell me in a second, but are they asking about, hey, how do we get more women in the boardroom, or how do we get more minorities in the boardroom, or how and when we are able to get them there, how do we use your system to prepare them for those roles? Well, you look at the school side, there is no succession planning. There are no future directors. They're effectively invited in, and even when you have your AGMs and you're hoping that people are going to be nominated, effectively those people are still being invited in. So we already have that sort of unfortunate gap or lack of directors. From the corporate side, and maybe this is something that schools can be learning from. How are they? What are you hearing? What kind of conversations are you having that are around succession planning?
Yeah, this is great. It's part of the evaluation process, and it's there's a couple of things. One is the evaluation process, and it's not just corporates; it's non-profits, etc. But again, non-profits are in the sort of same space as schools in terms of they're slightly less sophisticated, under-resourced, etc. So it's trying to bring the sort of like level of education, governance education, what I call governance geekness, to those sort of organisations, which may not be as professionally run. Doesn't mean professionally run means success, as you can see by a whole bunch of different stories. Usually it's human failings more than process failings. But what you're seeing is two things. One is in the evaluation process, they're very conscious of term limits, what's the succession coming up, also strategic planning in terms of where are our gaps in the boardroom, but also subcommittees. How are they using their subcommittees to blood new talent? Subcommittees are an extremely effective way of a board delegating governance responsibilities as opposed to management responsibilities. This is one of their main duties, to specialist groups who can be made up of voting directors and non-voting directors, so committee members. So let's see, for example, say you've got a non-profit, you might have a governance subcommittee, but you're probably going to have a fundraising subcommittee, because that's your biggest thing, is how do we actually raise funds? Where's our income coming from to do the work that we want to do? So you can bring in a few board members who can think from a governance point of view, and then some fundraising specialists from a strategic point of view. Schools might have a curriculum subcommittee or a community engagement subcommittee, beyond the normal ones. And again, you bring in, or even we talked about this in the recruitment side of things, a nominations subcommittee. And again, you might have a few directors on that or governors on that, and you might have an HR specialist or a marketing communications specialist who can help you do different aspects of the recruitment and hiring process. And that's a great way, because then you might find that one of these people, these subcommittees, when you've got succession planning, they're your bench, they're your substitutes. Like, okay, we don't have to actually work too hard to find the right person potentially, because they're there. Yeah. So that's a really good way of planning for the succession, actually developing the pipeline at the same time. There's some other stuff that goes on around the world, like observer programs, whereby people get to sit on boards and get to learn that stuff, or the sort of the board ready type stuff that we do. But it's still very much about communicating that being on a board is a worthwhile experience, and the impact and the difference you're going to make is worth the hard work, the commitment, the potential stress, and whatever stuff, and the workload that comes with it. And every board's different, but those are the key things that I'm seeing when it comes to pipeline development.
Yeah. So I mean, I think a good place to end now is just kind of sum up some of the things we said. I mean, what the school board should be looking at doing is really looking at their board from the perspective of how do we fare in terms of gender, generational, cultural, race, skills. These are the top 5 ones that we're looking at. But obviously, when we look at gender and race, those are top as far as like awareness goes, just because of what's in the news, and that's what today's all about, is looking at how boards should be looking at those news headlines. But then additionally, all right, hey, if we're starting to see that we have that issue, Well, to get ahead of it before people start complaining about it, how do we start getting these, whether it be the gender, the race, or the cultural lenses, how do we get that sort of diversity built into the board? Well, if we look at what's going out in the corporate world, it's because, they have succession planning. They've identified these, they've done those evaluations, and they're inviting these people to play different roles within the school. And they're not delegating management, as you said, but they're delegating governance. And some governance related tasks could just be as simple as just doing communications. At which case, let's empower advocates to go out there. And as we have empowered them, then we can invite them into the board later when appropriate. So, hey, Paul, I want to thank you again. This has been an awesome learning conversation. I look forward to joining you November 27th when we talk about communicating effectively in the boardroom. And for everybody that's going to be watching this before that event, that invitation will be going out soon. If you're not on our mailing list, at the end of this video, you'll see our contact information. Reach out to us, and we'll make sure you get an invite. Have a good day.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Bye.